Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. Today, I am delighted to welcome Michelle Holliday, organizational consultant and author of The Age of Thrivability. And we will be discussing thriving, of course, and conversations to enable and sustain thrivability. So, Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Susie.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Michelle, you are an organizational consultant and a facilitator for communities and business, but specializing in living systems theory and how that can be applied to communities and business. And your book on thrivability is about making it accessible to everyone through practical wisdom, which is also a quest we share and that we spoke about before the show. But I love the idea of offering practical guidance and actions on this key topic because I think as we move into today's more complex world, the need for generative and regenerative and humane models has never been greater. So I'm going to stop there, otherwise we'll launch into a whole different podcast. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you got to this subject and your story to thriving, if you like?
Thank you, Susie. And let me say also that I've been thrilled to discover you and your work. It's wonderful
Thank you.
to be connected with a kindred spirit. I see so much that's familiar in
Mm,
things that you are also bringing to the world. So my story starts with brand strategy. That was the first phase of my career, international marketing. I worked for two big multinational companies, and that was where I first became deeply disillusioned. It was really interesting work, but I also could immediately see that there was something missing in how we engage with customers and community, the responsibility and the
mm,
relationship we have with them, which seemed to me very superficial and manipulative. And in one case, one of the companies was Coca-Cola. I don't drink soft drinks. I think
okay.
they're bad for you. And so there
Yeah.
was this crisis of conscience as well. And I saw that internally the culture was fiercely competitive, and I didn't understand that. So all of it made me
Mm,
believe that something is missing in the story we have about business and work and purpose. I moved
absolutely.
into organizational development, quite a big career shift,
Mm,
and it felt better, but I still noticed the same story
yeah.
present.
Yeah.
And so I started to dig more deeply. And this was in the late 1990s. And 2000, 2001, I went deeper into independent research. My sense was that at the root of every major problem we face, and we were starting to recognize this issue of sustainability, but we
Mm,
couldn't figure out how to, we couldn't imagine how to be differently. So at the root of all of those seems to be a story that tells us everything in the world operates like a machine, including us, including our organizations, including our
mm,
economies. It tells us that we're separate from each other, separate from nature.
mm,
And I thought there must be more. There must also be life. And so I explored, investigated biology to understand what does it mean for something to be alive? What does it take for something that's alive to thrive? And do we find those patterns, those conditions in our organizations and communities as well? And of course, we do.
mm.
I went further into research and developed some frameworks, and I've been using those for the last 25 years. So that's enough for now.
Yeah, I mean, and we will be coming into some of those frameworks. I just love the idea of living systems.
Mhm.
And you have this survival of the fittest thing. You also have this adaptive capacity to change and this holistic view of systems as a system, whether it's my inside my body, whether it's ants in a colony, whether it's trees. We see the wisdom of
Mhm.
natural systems. And of course, they are living systems. Um, and I know the first sort of thing is that organizations are living systems. They're
Mhm.
not org charts on a 2D binary page. They are actually made up of people and they will evolve and live, and so will the culture as we move, work, act, and interact together. So let's start with I love the way in your book where you distinguish between the patterns of thrivability.
Mhm.
I'm a big believer in patterns and discussing, noticing, and working on patterns. So, can you tell us more about the patterns before we move on to the second part, which is the practices, of course, and how you put your understanding of those patterns into practice? But you have the four patterns of diversity, nourishment, learning, and emergence. And I would just love for you to walk us through what understanding those patterns, Michelle, means for me as an individual and how I show up in whatever system we're talking about, whether it's a business or a community or society at large.
Beautiful. Great question. Thank you. I believe it changes everything. This is a radical transformation,
Mm,
radical shift. And this mechanistic story is so all pervasive that we don't even recognize it. We start to see hints of it in our language, like human resources, human
yeah.
capital, that we
Uh,
we we see ourselves, see each other as things, as commodities. The organization seen as something that is somehow static and separate from us. But when we recognize that we are participating in a dynamic living world, it
mm,
shifts the purpose. It shifts what makes sense in how we relate to each other and what
mm,
responsibility we have to each other and to the world. It shifts what's possible, that we
mm,
can be in learning and curiosity and profound service and sensing. This, you mentioned the phrase survival of the fittest. It is to
yeah.
fit into something.
Yeah.
This is the idea that you fit well in relationship to a dynamic world. So it's the most continuously fit in an evolving context. So there's deep relationality to that. And so when I talk about thrivability, I talk about this as a practice, an informed intention and practice of enabling life to
Mm,
thrive.
mm,
Intention is the starting point. This is maybe the first major shift, that when we recognize that there is a living world, we are living, participating, and even within our organizations, even within our conversations, then we can set the intention
mm.
to enable life to thrive. And we don't do that now. We set our sights on something far less than enabling life to thrive in most of our work, in most of our contexts. So that's a first major shift
Mm.
in intention. And then I find that it's helpful to be informed. If we're going to enable life
Of
to
course.
thrive, then we need to know,
Mm,
what does that mean? What does that require of us? What does that involve? And there are many ways to get informed. Indigenous wisdom, the intuition that you
mm,
carry, poetry, spirituality. I turned to biology to be informed.
mm-hmm,
So these patterns that I draw on are the patterns that are present in all living systems, in our bodies, in rainforests, in ant colonies, in our organizations, communities, projects, economies. And I'll describe them just a little bit differently than the four terms that
mm,
you used. Those are perfect, but another way of thinking of them is that every living system has diverse parts,
yeah.
and we want to invite that diversity in our organizations. That's us with our
Mm,
passion,
mm,
with our gifts and contributions that we show up with, and we want to be nourished in the process of sharing them. So diverse parts, the parts are connected and supported in patterns and structures of relationship and flow. I think
mm,
that as the practices of interaction and the practice ground that supports and
mm,
connects us. So parts in relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole, a new level of life with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And in human context, what enables that is shared purpose, what enables
mm,
something more to be possible, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when we come together in shared purpose, it holds us together like a magnet.
mm,
We're not
mm.
just a crowd anymore. You are
No.
more than just a collection of cells. You are this whole being, and you can move and think and feel. And in organizations, we're capable of complex tasks and of building things, discovering things, sensing things that we wouldn't be able to do alone. And that's the magic we're
Mm,
after.
mm.
And then the final piece is, I think it's just life, that
Yeah.
there is life. We recognize that there's something that
Yeah.
animates
Yeah.
and integrates parts
Mm,
into relationship and into
mm,
emergent, convergent wholeness. And that's the difference between us and mechanical systems. A car is a system, but it doesn't have these properties of innovation, of healing, of generating a whole new car, of
Mm,
responding to changing circumstances. So for those things, we need something else. And
mm,
to me, that's the spark of life. We don't even have to know what that is, where it comes from, but we have to acknowledge it. And
mm,
that shifts then how we show up
mm,
as stewards and gardeners cultivating
mm,
those conditions.
mm. It's interesting though, because that's the magic of collective intelligence, isn't it? So,
Right.
but you have to be willing to garden without necessarily knowing what you're growing. So there may
Exactly.
not be a packet telling you exactly what's going to happen. Reminds me of your basil seed story in your book, of
Yes, that's right.
of what's going to happen. What's going to happen when we cultivate one part of a system without really looking at the system. And I think if I come back to the word that's really sticking with me is integration, Michelle, that diversity of parts, we have all of those individually in organizational systems and they remain individual,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
is where this compete and compare comes from in terms of how we work as opposed to collaborate and care. Because for
Mhm.
me, thrivability is about that. It's about collaboration, but it's about caring and living systems are living, like you say, and there's a lot of emotions, feelings, conversations, human connection in those systems. And, you tell us, I learned a lot about that in your chapter on social context,
Mhm.
as well as how the brain works, which is a different chapter. But those two together on where you're discussing, just like creativity, we all had a convergent perspective in the different eras of how humanity has grown to be what it is today. And that, a lot of it gets dampened as we need to step into a model that is
Mhm.
mainly mechanistic today. But
Mhm.
what we really need is something more holistic, more emergent, and essentially more compassionate for
Mhm.
humanity. So, what does this bring, therefore, to the core practices of thrivability for you? This fact that we all had a convergent perspective at one early time in our lives,
Mhm.
and it's
Mhm.
clearly still part of my operating system, just like creativity before I went to school, which is a
Right.
loaded statement, but I do believe that education today
Right.
squashes creativity as opposed to enhancing it or nurturing it. So when I read your chapter on social context, that's the feeling it gave me is, wow, how come we've been dampening all this when it could have been going in parallel, just like natural systems do, to make sure that they can adapt and let things emerge when they need to, so that their species or their plants or their system can thrive. So
Mhm.
what does that bring to the model of core practices for thrivability in an organization where today we're a group of individuals, is my observation, and what we're
Mhm.
looking for is collective intelligence?
Mhm. Mhm. There's so much there. And let me just say I love your two phrases from compete and compare to collaborate and care.
It's the shift I think we need to make in organizational culture. My goodness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's profound and sort of revolutionary. This is the shift exactly. So I think what you're pointing to is recognition that this is in some ways not new. These are human qualities to collaborate and
Mm,
care. This is not something that I have to teach you or have to maybe I do have to convince, but the convincing is that it's allowed, that it's reasonable.
yes.
It's
Permission. Yeah.
reasonable even in our organizations, but these are human qualities. They're because we are living systems, they're qualities that we also possess, they're capabilities that
Mm,
we hold. And the chapter you're talking about is um, pointing to this fascinating progression I noticed in human development that
mm,
we all show up with consciousness of wholeness and only that as babies, as
mm,
infants. We're only able to comprehend the present moment. We experience life as fundamentally whole and unbroken. And then we move into a developmental phase where we sense relationality. So I
mm,
think about the toddler who likes to drop the thing on the floor and
mm,
watch the adult pick it up again and again. And this is an experience of being in relationship. If
mm,
I do this, you will do that. And isn't this
mm.
fun?
Terrible
And
twos.
yeah, exactly. And it goes into kind of
Mm,
the experience of youth where it's all about how you fit in relationship. all about belonging. And then we move further into individuation and experience ourselves as distinct parts. And we could create a society of wisdom that is able to integrate all of those, doesn't cast aside that experience of fundamental wholeness, of oneness, that Eastern traditions, that indigenous cultures tell us is also true, that doesn't cast aside the relationality, the process nature of existence, but is able to hold all of those together. And this is what we see in the wisdom that, if we're lucky, comes with age, but we can design for that, and we can design practice grounds, including our organizations, to develop the integration of all of those ways of understanding reality. And the good news is it results in better results also.
Yes. Yeah,
Better
yeah, of course.
organizational
Yeah.
results. Yeah, as we tend to the relationships, as we're curious and learning together in our collaboration and care, and as we tap into the wisdom of the whole or wholes that we're part of through our intuition, through conversational methods, that we recognize we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And we say this, but there's a kind of a deeper level of intention that's possible, and that we see emerging in the world of work and in the work that people like you and I do.
And I think it's interesting because we do see that primal pull to belong, to be part of something. But if it's to be part of a system that's defined mechanistically, then we will become human doings as opposed to human beings. Like, let's put it that way. It's all about
Yeah.
how much you deliver, what you do. The results are individual, although the business has collective results. So I think it's really interesting because it's this whole learn, unlearn, relearn trilogy, which I think is more important now than ever before, around unlearning formatting that's been put on top of natural formatting, because we are made, in inverted commas, to hold multiple perspectives. Now, this is one of the things I help leaders with the most, is how can I hold multiple perspectives and come to a different collective result? Because we're stuck in this paradigm of knowing as opposed to learning. And I think, the collective consciousness and the collective experience that indigenous wisdom brings us, and that they take as the starting point, is really, really powerful. And of course, in the Western world, we've learned not to do that. We've learned other ways of relating, interacting, and conversing. And when we were chatting before the show, when you said, conversations as living systems, that phrase, one, it really stuck in my mind, and two, what it conjured up for me was incredibly powerful. And can you tell us more about that idea of conversations, Michelle, as living systems? Because for me, collaboration is about the quality of conversations. You can learn any tool you want, but unless you can relate in a meaningful way to the person or people you're having a conversation with, I'm not sure we can have a collective experience. And I'd be really interested in your inputs from your research, but also your insights from your experience on that.
Exactly. If we can't be in meaningful, emergent, evolving, intentional relationship, then we're just separate parts. We're isolated from each other. We need that space of practice, that practice ground. And that is, if we stay in that experience of separateness, it's literally toxic.
Yes.
Life needs other life. We cannot thrive in isolation. So this is part of why we have this common experience of toxic workplaces. So part of the message of that toxic approach is that conversation is a waste of time. It's not the doing, that meetings are a waste of time to be avoided. And as they're designed now, more like debate, maybe they are a waste of time. But if we design them to be more effective, to be more constructive, more generative, they can be regenerative, they can be healing. I wrote an article about this that I noticed that was the word that kept coming up after meetings that I would host. People would say that was healing. And I thought, what a funny word to use for a meeting.
For a
But
meeting, yeah.
this is the experience that's possible. Not only is it generative of new possibilities, but it's regenerative. It's nourishing to us. So what you and I had talked about was how it's this microcosm of those patterns of living systems. We are
Mm,
diverse parts, you and I. We each
mm,
bring different perspectives. And the more we can invite those, the better. The more thrivability we
mm,
will cultivate in this living system that is you and me together. And we are in interaction and relationship and exchange. And the more we can design that for flow, the
mm,
more that we take turns, the more respect we have for each other, just basic things like speaking the same language and
mm,
having a good internet connection. These are things we can design for, both of
mm,
those or all of those. And the more that we bring to our conversation some shared purpose that is truly compelling, truly important, the more thrivability we will cultivate, the more we will be held together like a magnet in
mm,
shared purpose, and more that our coming together will be not just the two of us, but something more. The whole will become greater than the sum of its parts. And the final piece, life, the more that we follow inspiration, follow the energy of life, follow our sense of what's really needed and possible and our
mm,
curiosity and emergence, more than trying to choreograph tightly, the more thrivability will be there. So that requires some faith,
mm.
some experience also. And this is where I think organizations are so important and have a responsibility that isn't widely recognized, that the more we create practice grounds for being in complexity,
Yeah.
being with diversity, but also in wholeness and convergence, in shared purpose, the more we create practice grounds for that in our organizations, the more that spreads out into society as well.
Mm,
We see so much
mm.
fear and division and reaction against change because we have no practice
Yeah.
of navigating complexity and change and diversity. So I see that organizations are the new commons.
Yeah.
This is the only place we have.
Mm.
And this is, I think, a key way that we will create a more wise and peaceful society. And it starts with the conversation.
Of
That's
course, yeah.
the heart.
And I
Hmm.
think we've stepped into practice, haven't we? A discussion around practice and intentionality and safe
Hmm.
practice. We'll come to the safe part later, but I love the example in your book of, and I wonder if you could just walk us through it. It was very impactful for me around the Space for Life experiment that went on in the Montreal museums and how the whole team, the whole organization in that case, um, convened around the greater good and what
Hmm.
it brought to them. And for me, it was a model that made so much sense, but it's completely different from what I would have started out with in an organizational context because that's not the way we do things. So
Hmm.
I'd really love it if you could just walk our listeners through. Unfortunately,
Hmm.
we don't have the time to go, through it in great detail, but I think just the learnings from that experiment and an outline of the experiment, I found that so impactful, particularly around organizational ways of working and structure.
Yes. I wonder if you would share, what do you think the normal thing would be? Should I share context first, or could you just say what did you have in mind when you said that part?
So basically, normally we wouldn't be thinking that far out of the box. We'd do some brainstorming, we'd share
Mm,
ideas, but everybody is still sat with their pair of glasses on. Okay,
yeah.
so their lens of how we normally do things. And we might step out of that, which makes it feel like innovation or feel a little bit different.
Hmm.
But what they came up with was completely different.
Yeah.
The three
Yeah.
pillars, the way
Right.
they've done
Right.
it, the ways of working and routines they put around it. And I think that's something that organizational teams of smart, enthusiastic people could get to quite easily
Mhm.
if we could give them different lenses. Hence
Yes.
my question.
Thank you. So the context is that there were four museums, four nature museums, an insectarium, a botanical gardens, a planetarium, and a biodome. The biodome is several ecosystems recreated under one roof. You walk in and you're in the rainforest.
Mm,
Walk further, you're in the Laurentian Mountain ecosystem. And they were all owned by the city of Montreal and all separate And at one point, the mayor decided to merge them administratively to save some money. You can fire
Yes.
3 out of 4 human resources managers and finance, and just have one. And what's the difference? They're all nature museums. But he also had a vision that together maybe more was possible. And so a new director was appointed who was quite visionary and charismatic. And here's where it diverges, because I think, as you're saying, the normal thing would be to keep the conversation separate and also isolated to the leadership team.
Yeah. Yeah.
But because we came with the understanding that this is a whole ecosystem, these are 4 different ecosystems, and how do we see if there is the possibility of them coming together as 4 complementary ecosystems? Can they feed and nurture each other? It was important to bring the whole system together.
Yeah.
And to draw on as much of the intelligence of that system as possible. So it was a very participatory process, including conversations throughout the organization and one big gathering. And in this case, it was 650 employees. So it was possible to bring them together for a day, the first time that it had ever been together. And we went through these conditions, these patterns. What will it look like when each of us is able to bring our gifts and be nourished in the process? What will it look like when work flows beautifully? And what is the one conversation we all want to have with the world? This is how we explored the living nature of shared purpose. And in all of it, there was a real listening to the voice of the whole, to life. All of this was done in a very creative way and engaging and participatory way. And so this is part of how we invite life in. And what they came to was a really compelling vision for themselves. And the sort of, maybe the bottom line is they came up with a name for themselves together. They kept their individual diverse identities, because we still want to keep the diversity of the parts, but together they form what they call a space for life, espace pour la vie in French. And I thought this is such a beautiful way of describing them, but almost any organization. It is a space for life. That's what we're cultivating here. I use the word thrivability, and unfortunately, it doesn't translate well into French. But I often use this word, espace pour la vie. But it's about that. It's about stewarding, cultivating your organization as a space for life. And it has worked out better for them by every measure, financially, organizationally. It has helped them to develop smoother processes of collaboration within each museum and across them. They've opened up their budgets to each other, where before it was fiercely competitive. And now they see that they have shared purpose, and their impact in the world is many times greater. It's so much richer, so much more generative and regenerative. So it's a beautiful story.
It is a beautiful story, and it really reminded me, is a great example of conversation as a system, because that's essentially what they did. And the fact that everybody's voice was heard. And I'm sure if I asked any one of those 650 people, do you feel that your idea was taken into account and contributed, even if your words weren't used in the final decision, they would say yes. And we can see the power of just listening to people and aligning on why we're doing what we're doing, and also holding different perspectives. The whole trifocal lens discussion, and you mentioned the word stewarding. I think it's so important.
Let me tell you one quick little bit about the museum story. My favorite moment in the whole process was gathering the 650 people again and inviting the mayor and other sort of dignitaries, officials, and people who were to witness their declaration. This is what we commit to. And at that gathering, there was one of the leaders who was a little bit of a holdover from the old days, and he left soon after. But the moment was when one of the blue-collar workers, it was a unionized context, and one of the kind of union members stood up and said, "I just want to say that this manifesto," there was a manifesto that was part of this, these are our words. These are not that guy's words. And he named the guy. These are our
Wow.
words, and that means
Mm.
we need to do this. It was so powerful.
Yeah.
So imagine this is what you want. You want that level of commitment
Yeah.
because they are our words.
Exactly. And it also busts the myth of, oh, well, they don't have time to do this, or they don't have ideas about this, or people that
Right.
it's so important that
Mhm.
everybody has something to contribute, which is your starting point in terms of living systems, and that we
Mhm.
steward that space, that conversation, and that system as leaders. But if I take a definition of leadership as somebody who has impact in a system, it's not just leaders on an organizational chart, it's how I lead myself and how I lead my communities and how I influence the people around me to make sure that there's enough awareness and understanding to keep this place going and to keep this, it's more than enthusiasm, isn't it? But this quest
Yes.
going, even when it gets tough, even if there's a crisis, even if the budgets are cut, even if people leave, even so. And that brings me to your sort of model of core practices, which I would
Mhm.
really like to explore
Mhm.
around, the need for open, safe practice grounds and how you got to that. What I love about the model, well, one of the things over and above its contents is the fact that the whole thing is a spiral.
Mhm.
So you're talking about core things, which are often, if I say core, people think of a box or something, platform, but this spiral of ongoing, iterative, cyclical practices. I would love it if you could walk our listeners through your model
Mhm.
of core
Sure.
practices and how you got there, Michelle, because you've done so much research. There's so much in your book. How did you hone it down into this spiral of core practices?
Mhm. I think it came partly out of necessity. I spent many years exploring this new way of seeing, and I would live there, I think, if I could. It's so fascinating. But it's not enough.
Mm,
I gave a TEDx talk a
mm,
couple of years ago and talked about how I first discovered these patterns and I came kind of running out into the streets going, it's about life. And doesn't that change everything? And the world kind of went, eh. So more is needed. But also along the way, I noticed that I could see the patterns and I could see this new life aligned worldview in all kinds of places. So I
mm,
was gathering things, gathering methods and resources and putting them in my backpack, which was getting heavier and heavier in a beautiful way, but this
mm,
massive collection of things that all seemed to me to go together. And at some point I realized there are categories here as well. These are practice areas, and it
mm,
can be helpful to tease them apart, even though they inform each other, but to zoom in for a time on one and then another. So there is at the core of this spiral, this new way of seeing, of seeing the world as fundamentally living and
mm.
dynamic. And from there, that moves us around the spiral to new
Byron.
being
Mm,
to this practice of stewardship. And I think of that as the combination of reverence and responsibility.
mm, mm,
Reverence
mm,
for the complexity, the potential that we can't fully know when something is alive, including our organizations, and yet we can feel called to respond
mm,
its needs as we understand them in a process of learning together. So, new ways of seeing, new ways of being, and still we need more. Still, there was this other category of new ways of interacting.
mm,
Part of a global community of practice called the art of hosting. This is facilitation methods like
mhm.
World Cafe and open
Yeah.
space and circle practice and more. And these are more aligned with life, with emergence, with drawing on more of the intelligence of the system. So that's part of the practice as well to gather
Mm,
the methods of supporting interaction that work for you in your context. And from there, we can be in the practice of listening for the voice of the whole, of new ways of serving, discovering new ways of serving. So if
mhm,
we're seeing, being, interacting, we start to be able to sense the change that the world needs us to be. And that's its own practice area as
mm,
well. From there, we can move into safe action. I think
Mm.
you pointed to that as well. And it's native action. What is the obvious next natural step here in this system? Because it is us, because it is now. What can we try out? In sociocracy, there's a phrase that we look for what is good enough for now and safe enough to try. This is a very life-aligned
Mm.
approach to action. And from there, we can ask not only how would we measure it, which is the mechanistic story's favorite question.
Of course, I was just going to say that. How do
Right,
you
right.
measure it? What's the ROI?
Yeah, and measuring is fine, but it's so
Mm.
small. And there are bigger questions like how will we know? So this is new ways of sensing whether we are contributing to life's ability to thrive or whether we are diminishing life's ability to thrive. And if so, what can we adapt? So new ways of seeing, new ways of being, new ways of interacting, new ways of serving, new ways of acting, new ways of sensing, and finally, new ways of evolving, of learning as
Mm.
an intention. Let's bring resources and skills to that as well. And that brings us back into the spiral.
Mm.
So we
And
deepen all of those practices then.
and it's a brilliant it's a brilliant spiral because I think that spiral has to function in a safe environment
Mhm.
on the premise that it's safe enough for now and therefore it's good enough to try.
Yeah.
I'm just going to come back to the measurement question because it's everybody's question. And like you
Hmm.
say in the mechanistic area and
Yeah.
today is how do you measure it? Can you prove to me that it's going to work? Give me a guarantee that if I change to this type of mindset, it will still produce the same business results. I had that conversation last week of, okay, so I want you to prove to me that this isn't an MVP and this is going to work. And it was like, wow, that's a
Mm.
different. So it was almost, we went back to the beginning in terms of why we were doing the culture change and things like that. But what I
Yeah.
really liked about the measurement, and I'd really like to just share is the fact that it's based on an adaptive agile
Hmm.
mindset. If I look at the Agile Manifesto, it's the Agile mindset, and I really like the sort of retrospective Scrum Kanban inspired board that you talk
Hmm.
about around noticing, implementing, practicing, and mastering.
Hmm.
Like the community board mastery, I think it's called.
Hmm.
If you could just explain that a little bit to our listeners, I think that's such a great way and a great compromise of is it good enough for now and is it safe enough to try? Because
Hmm.
otherwise, we could try and put KPIs on things that we're just going against why we're doing them, or trying to
Right.
box them into something binary and mechanistic, when in fact what we're trying to do is letting things emerge. And this is the
Right.
biggest struggle we have when I work with organizations, teams, and communities around, do we need to measure it? Yes, we do. How?
Right.
So I
Right.
liked the agile inspired thing because I
Hmm.
like agile and adaptive methods a lot, but we can get stuck in the mechanistic part of that.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Even agile can
Yeah,
be
exactly.
approached
Exactly.
mechanistically. I see
Yeah.
that so many times, so often. So there's two things I'm hearing in what you're talking about. One is the prove in advance that it will
Yes.
work, and the other is measure after the fact. Did it work?
Yeah.
And for the prove it question, the how will it work? There's such a fantastic short little book by Peter Block called The Answer to How is Yes. And he talks about how the question how is a defense against action. And
Oh, I
it's
like
often
that. Yeah.
the wrong question or it's asked too soon. That we would be wiser to ask what is worth doing. As you're saying, let's go
Yes.
back to the purpose.
Yeah.
Even if we don't know how it will work, is it worth doing? And if so, we'll find our way to the how. We can gather information. Let's be smart about it. But before we create this barrier that is the how. And it sounds like that's what you're
Mm.
experiencing. Prove to
Mm.
me
Yes.
without any doubt. Life doesn't work that way. There is
No.
no
No.
guarantee. There's smart and researched and thought out, but ultimately, if it's worth doing, then there is risk. We find ways to make it good enough for now, safe enough to try.
Exactly.
But the prove question in advance is not quite the right mindset. And then measure and prove, did it work? Again, it's not quite the right
Mm.
mindset. What I see is that there is value in monitoring, in sensing, and in, again, drawing as much of the system in as possible so that our monitoring has a generative and regenerative effect in itself.
Yeah.
So the more of the system that we bring in to decide what matters, the more generative and regenerative that process will be. Who gets to decide what we're going to pay attention to? And can we draw on more of the system's intelligence and energy to decide what will we pay attention to? How will we know? And then similarly, who gets to be in the noticing? Is it only the leaders? Is it only the accountants? Or can we all be part of that process of noticing through conversation, through gathering metrics and data? But can we come together in conversation to make sense of the data? And then who gets to respond as well is a key question. Who gets to receive the data and decide what are we going to do about it? And all of that, there are opportunities to cultivate more system capacity, more of the system's generative and regenerative capacity. So it's just, you were talking about the trifocal lens. It's not only how will we do things differently, what will we measure differently? It's not only doing different things. Let's do a Kanban board. That'll be good. It's seeing differently, seeing that the purpose is, first of all, to generate more capacity within the system, to generate new possibilities, to heal and create ever more wholeness for more and more of life.
Which is why we need stewardship, of course, because that's going to nurture that space, let's put it that way. But I love the fact that the first part of that measurement board was noticing.
Right.
Because, yes, there's data, but also one of my biggest practices that I give back to teams and leaders, and I use it myself, is notice what you notice.
Exactly.
That observation without judgment, just notice what you notice about a behavior, a project, an MVP, a tool, but just notice what you notice about how people are reacting, acting, and interacting to certain things. And I think we don't do enough of that in our daily lives in general, but particularly not in organizations. Nobody sits there and goes, well, I'm just going to take 5 minutes to notice. They don't. If they did, I think we'd have a different conversation.
I'm part of a group convening investors in a couple of weeks to reimagine investing, the world of investment. And the opening question we have in mind is, what are you noticing in the world or in yourself that brings you to this conversation? It's so much power in noticing what you notice.
Exactly. I'm going to call you once you've done that and find out what they noticed. I'm really interested now.
And to hear from others as well. What are we noticing?
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings me to also your model, but how we operationalize your model. And I know you've crafted a program around it, Michelle. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that looks like, what it is, because I think one of the hardest things is, how do I operationalize, how do I apply what I'm learning as I'm learning it? Because, what do I let emerge? What do I steward? What do I hold? So it would be great if you could just explain a little bit more about your program and how it can equip practitioners and leaders to actually apply what they're learning.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's called Practicing Regeneration. It offers the foundations of the practice of regeneration and thrivability. And it offers 4 things, really. One is practice and stories and support for telling this new story, this living systems worldview. I know from experience how challenging it is to speak this new language and cross the bridge between what we can see as possible and the dominant story that we still have. So It's offering people an opportunity to develop a sense of ease and confidence in inviting others into this new worldview. The second thing is methods,
Mm,
really frameworks and tools that are practical. Some of the
mm,
things that we've been talking about, and in particular around conversation and convening, because that's at the heart of
of
this
course. Mm,
transition in this work. The third thing is really some clear attention to that demonstrating value, and we might say measuring impact, but we know that it's more than
mm,
that. So
mm.
how do we address that in particular? Because as you've experienced, people want to know. They want to
Yeah.
know, that first one is tell me how it's going to work and prove to me that it did work. And then the final piece is a community of others.
Mm,
This takes so much courage.
yeah.
At least that's been my experience. And
Absolutely. Mm,
yeah, and so to be in shared learning with others is so valuable and nourishing. So those are
mm.
kind of the four components. It's 9 weeks, 2 hours a week. We skip three actually, so it ends up being 12, but it's 9 sessions, all online. People from around the world, but people who are either consultants, coaches, facilitators, or internal change makers.
Mm,
So leaders at any level, but who are convening, who see
mm.
themselves in that role as stewards more than as managers. And there's always a place for management, but just not of life. There
Yeah.
are things to be managed, but not people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, does that make
It
sense?
does. It does. Thank you. I think it's, the new conversations that need to happen in the shift as well, doesn't it? But I mean, I think change making is incredibly exciting. I think that's what I've done for all my career, but it can be quite lonely, can't it? It can be
Yeah.
quite lonely, and having if you're in an organization, having a community outside with which to share, and that light bulb of, oh, yeah, that happens to you as well. Okay. Okay, so it's not just me and my organization. So
Mhm.
I think that's also incredibly helpful in terms of getting different inspiration and just a different
Mhm.
practice space, if you like. Um,
Yeah. And if we think about that backpack of mine of all these
mm,
different methods, we come through different doorways. There
of course.
there's a whole practice area called developmental evaluation that is rethinking the measurement.
Mm,
So if there's someone in this circle that comes through that doorway, they have resources. There's
yeah,
there's agile as
yeah,
an approach to action,
yeah,
and maybe there's someone in the cohort who brings those skills. There are people from different contexts who have, so there's also resourcing each other, which is
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah. And I'm a big believer in creating a model that works for you or your organization, and that is great for that, isn't it? Just taking bits of everything to sort of
Yeah,
stitch it together into
right.
something that works for the way you convene in your
Yeah.
environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Michelle, time is running. Do you have one last call to action or recommendation for listeners who are thinking, right, I've got to step more boldly
Mm-hmm.
into this space of emergence with the objective of creating the conditions, which is a leader's job for me, creating the conditions for people to thrive?
Mm. Such a good question. I think the call to action would be get informed, get clear on your intention,
Mm,
and commit to the practice. I talked about stewardship and thrivability as this informed intention and practice. And by practice, I don't just mean methods. I
hmm.
mean it as a life practice, like a yoga practice, a spiritual practice, a martial arts practice. It's so important to recognize it as a life process, an
Mm,
unfolding and a deepening in wisdom and compassion. And it's an individual and a collective practice. So just know this is not a program. As much as I'm offering a
mm,
program, that is part of your developing practice. It's not something that you check off your to-do list, but that you commit to. And
mm.
know that it will be beautiful and inspiring at times and discouraging and challenging at times, but this is the work. This
Yeah,
is what's needed. And both because the stakes are dire
Yeah.
and because the potential is so beautiful. It's so truly inspiring. So that
Mm.
would be my call to action.
All right, super. Thank you. I'm going to leave our listeners with that call to action and the fact that we are more intelligent together. I'm just going to leave it at that. Michelle, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights, your stories, and your program with us. Where can people find out more about you and what you do and your program?
Thank you. There's a platform called Thrivable World,
Okay.
thrivableworld.com, that has information about my body of work and about the program. And it's a space that I launched recently that I hope will evolve and involve other people as well,
Mhm.
contributing to it. So thrivableworld.com.
Okay, super. And I will put that link in the show notes so that people can find it easily.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for a great conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.